If you could summarize the entire religion of Islam in a single conversation, this would be it. Is Islam merely a set of rituals? Is faith simply belief? And what does it mean be spiritually excellent? These questions lie at the heart of a remarkable conversation, the Hadith of Gabriel. My name is Muhammad al-Shammari, and this series will explore the ideas, histories, and concepts that continue to shape the Islamic tradition and our understanding of ourselves. Imagine sitting with the Prophet ﷺ one ordinary day. The companions were gathered around him when suddenly a stranger appeared. His clothes were exceedingly white, his hair was exceedingly black. He showed no signs of travel, yet none of the companions recognized him from town, which was unusual for travelers at that period. He walked directly to the Prophet ﷺ, sat closely in front of him, placed his knees against the Prophet's knees, and rested his hands upon his thighs. Then he said, "O Muhammad, tell me about Islam." The Prophet answered, "Islam is to testify that there is no God worthy of worship but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God, to establish prayer, give charity, fast Ramadan, and to perform pilgrimage to the house if able." The stranger replied, "You have spoken truthfully." The companions were surprised. He was asking questions, yes, confirming the answers. Then he asked, "Tell me about Iman." The Prophet said, "To believe in God, His angels, His books, His messengers, and the last day, and the divine decree and its good and its difficult aspects." The man again replied, "You have spoken truthfully." Then he asked, "Tell me about Ihsan." The Prophet answered, "To worship Allah as though you see Him, and if you don't see Him, then know that He sees you." Finally, the man asked about the hour, the last day, and its signs. After he left, the Prophet ﷺ informed the companions, "This was Jibreel, he came to teach you your religion." This hadith is often called the Hadith of Gabriel. Many scholars describe it as one of the most comprehensive explanations of Islam ever given. It presents Islam as a complete way of life, consisting of three dimensions: Islam, Iman and Ihsan. Together they form outward action, inward belief, and spiritual excellence of a believer. When Jibreel asked the Prophet about Islam, the Prophet did not begin with an abstract definition. Instead, he described Islam through its visible pillars: the testimony of faith, prayer, charity, fasting, and the pilgrimage. Yet throughout history, scholars have also discussed the deeper meaning of the word Islam itself. Classical Muslim scholars explained Islam linguistically through ideas such as submission, surrender, and willing obedience to God. In Islamic creed, Islam is often defined: submit oneself to God through affirming His oneness, yielding to Him in obedience, and renouncing all forms of polytheism. Today, however, English speakers have heard a different definition. Islam is to submit your will to God. This phrase became popular in modern English-speaking Muslim communities. But where did it come from? Part of the answer lies in the challenge of translating Islamic concepts into modern Western intellectual framework. In Western philosophy, especially after the philosopher Immanuel Kant, the concept of the will became one of the essential features of a human identity in the West. Kant distinguished between inclinations, our desires, impulses, and emotional tendencies, and the will, the faculty through which a person determines what she or he ought to do. Because the will occupies such an important place in modern discussions of morality, some translators and writers began explaining Islam as submission to God's will, and eventually submitting one's will to God. This was not necessarily intended as a literal translation of the Arabic word Islam. Rather, it was an attempt to communicate deeper spiritual reality in language familiar to modern readers in the West. Interestingly, there is an Islamic concept that comes very close to what many translators were trying to express: ikhlas, or sincerity. Classical scholars often defined ikhlas through singling out one's purpose in worship to God alone. In other words, the heart becomes devoted to a single ultimate goal rather than being pulled in competing directions. This brings us to an important insight found in both Islamic spirituality and in a different way in modern psychology. Human beings do not possess only one desire. We have many desires, many motivations, and many competing attachments. At any given moment, a person may simultaneously desire comfort, status, pleasure, and truth all at once. Islam does not deny this complexity. In fact, much of spiritual purification begins with recognizing that. Classical scholars often distinguished between three related concepts: irada, which is desire, inclination, or wanting; niyyah, which means intention; qasd, deliberate purpose or direction. You could think of them as three stages. First comes irada. The heart contains many possible desires and inclinations. Then comes niyyah. The intention filters, organizes, and prioritizes those competing desires. It chooses which desire will be acted upon. Finally comes qasd. Qasd is a conscious orientation of the self toward a chosen goal. It's purposeful direction and movement toward an objective. From this perspective, one might say that the will in the Kantian sense is actually closer to qasd than irada. Irada also refers to desire itself, and human beings may possess many different iradat. Qasd, however, represents a final orientation that emerges after those competing desires have been sorted and directed. It's the self deliberately aiming toward a chosen end. This helps explain why scholars frequently define ikhlas through qasd rather than irada. The goal in Islam is not to eliminate desires, rather to purify competing motives, refine intention, and direct the entire self or person toward God. When God addressed Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in Surah Al-Imran verse 20, "Ajjuka faqul aslamtu wajhi lillahi wa man ittaba'ani," it says, if they argue with you, say, I have submitted my face to Allah and also those who have followed me. In Arabic, the face does not merely refer to physical feature. It symbolizes the direction in which a person turns and the reality towards which he or she is oriented. For this reason, many classical commentators explain submission, aslamtu, in the verse through concepts such as ikhlas or sincerity, obedience and surrender, and exclusive orientation toward God. Viewed from this perspective, the modern phrase submit your will to God is not entirely wrong. It points toward a genuine Islamic idea, but the classical framework is more precise. Islam is not fundamentally about suppressing your desires. It's about purifying desires, refining intention, singling out one's purpose and direction towards God. Or as the scholar expressed it, to make God alone the ultimate purpose and direction of worship. That is the deeper spiritual meaning that is beneath the outward practice of Islam. The problem, according to Islam, is not human beings have desires. The problem is when these desires compete with God's ultimate loyalty. This is why Islam is not merely a set of rituals, it's a lifelong process of purification and sincerity in alignment with the divine guidance. However, the Prophet ﷺ defined Islam through actions in the Hadith, the 5 pillars. The Prophet also defined Islam through its social effects. He said, Al-Muslim man salim al-Muslimun min lisanihi wa yadihi. A Muslim is the one whose tongue in hand others are safe. When asked which Islam was best, he said, أن تطعم الطعام وتقرأ السلام على من عرفت ومن تعرف. Feeding people and greeting those who you know and those who you don't know with peace. Islam, therefore, is not only personal devotion, but it's social peace, which lays the foundation upon which thriving communities are built. When people trust one another, uphold justice, and show mercy, prosperity becomes more than a material wealth, it becomes the well-being of a society as a whole. After explaining Islam, Jibreel asked about Iman. In English, Iman is usually translated as faith, but the two words are not exactly identical. In English, the word faith comes from the Latin fides, which is strongly associated with trust, confidence, and loyalty. The Arabic word Iman comes from the root connected to Aman, which means security. Classical scholars described Iman as belief in the heart, affirmation by the tongue, and action through the body. Another important Arabic word is i'tiqad, or belief. It comes from the root meaning to tie, to bind, to strengthen, to make firm. The same root is used in contracts, covenants, oaths, and marriage. This shows that belief in Islam is not merely having an opinion. It's a belief that becomes firmly established and the heart shapes the way a person lives. In this sense, faith and Iman have slightly different centers of gravity. Faith often emphasizes trust, Iman emphasizing finding security and stability with recognizing the truth. The Quran in Surah Al-Ra'd verse 28 describes the believers, those who believe and whose hearts find peace in the remembrance of God. Surely in the remembrance of God, hearts find rest. The Prophet then listed the 6 pillars of Iman: believe in God, believe in angels, believe in the revealed books, believe in the messengers, believe in the last day, believe in the divine decree, its good and difficult aspects. These are not simply doctrines to memorize. Together they form a complete worldview. Believe in Allah gives life its ultimate center. True belief is not merely acknowledging God's existence. It includes love, gratitude, worship, reliance, and trust. Scholars often compared believers to a bird. Its head is love, one wing is fear, the other wing is hope. Without hope, fear becomes despair. Without fear, hope becomes complacency. Together they create a balance, allow a believer to move toward God. Believe in angels remind us that reality is greater than we can see. Angels are real creations of God and carry out God's commands. The Quran in Surah Fussilat, Ayah 31, records them saying to the believers, "We are your allies in this life and the hereafter." Classical scholars explain that angels support, encourage, strengthen, and protect believers by God's commands. Belief in the scriptures teaches us that humanity was not abandoned without guidance. Revelation serves as guidance, remembrance, and criterion to distinguish truth from falsehood. Belief in messengers reminds us that prophets were not merely messengers of information. They were guides, reformers, teachers, and exemplars. Belief in the last day gives profound meaning to existence. Without ultimate accountability, many questions appear unresolved. Oppression may seem victorious, sacrifice may seem pointless, justice may seem incomplete. But the Quran says in Surah Al-Anbiya verse 47, "We set up the scale of justice for the day of judgment, and no soul will be wronged in the least. And even if it was a deed that is the weight of a mustard seed, we will bring it forth, and sufficient are we as vigilant reckoner." The last day assures believers that ultimate justice belongs to God. Finally comes belief in the divine decree, known as Qadr. Islam teaches that God possesses complete knowledge, wisdom, and authority over creation. Yet human beings remain morally responsible for their choices. Islam rejects both absolute determinism and absolute independence. Ali bin Abi Talib once explained this balance beautifully. A man asked Ali whether human beings are compelled or free. Ali told him to raise one foot. The man did. Then Ali asked him to raise the other while standing on the first. The man replied, "I can't." Ali explained that human freedom exists, but within limits established by God. It's a matter between two extremes. After Islam comes Ihsan. This is the highest level. The Prophet ﷺ defined it with remarkable simplicity: to worship Allah as though you see Him, and if you don't see Him, then know He sees you. Ihsan is spiritual excellence. It's transformation of knowledge into awareness. A person may know that Allah exists and that God sees him, but Ihsan means living with that awareness every day, when alone, when worshipping, when facing temptation. It's the state in which the heart becomes free of worldly attachments and deeply connected to its creator. This is why scholars often connected Ihsan to the purification of the heart and to sincerity. The believer strives not merely to perform good deeds, but to perform them with a heart that's conscious of God. Ihsan is where the outward world of Islam and the inward world of Iman becomes united. No one knows what's truly happening inside of your heart, but God knows, and that changes everything. The more the heart is purified, the less effort it takes to remember God's presence. Not because you constantly force yourself to remember, but because the distance between your inner reality and God's reality has become smaller. Ihsan is complete sincerity before the one who knows every secret. Finally, Jibreel asked about the hour, the last day. The Prophet ﷺ replied, "The one being asked knows no more than one asking." Even Jibreel and the Prophet ﷺ did not know when it would occur. Only Allah knows that. But the Prophet ﷺ mentioned two signs. The slave woman would give birth to her mistress, and you will see the barefoot poor shepherds competing in constructing tall buildings. Scholars have discussed various interpretations of the first sign throughout history. As for the second sign, many scholars understood it as a dramatic reversal in worldly conditions. People who once possessed very little wealth and influence would become wealthy and compete in displays of status, luxury, and monumental constructions. The point of these signs is not merely prediction. They remind us that the world is temporary. Civilizations rise and fall, power changes hands, and the hereafter remains. The Hadith of Gabriel teaches that Islam is far more than a collection of beliefs or rituals. Islam is outward submission through action, Iman is inward belief, conviction and certainty, Ihsan is spiritual excellence and awareness of God. Together they form a complete vision for human life. The body submits through worship, the mind believes through faith, and the heart becomes purified through ihsan. And all three direct the human being toward a single purpose: to know God, worship Him sincerely, and return to Him prepared for the last day. For this reason, many scholars have said the Hadith of Gabriel is not merely a lesson about religion, it's a lesson about what it means to be fully human before God. Assalamu alaikum.